Hello everyone and welcome to the Adams and Reese HR Summit. I'm David Katz, team leader for the Privacy, Cybersecurity, and Data Management team, and I'm based in our Atlanta offices. Joining me is Angela Great, and our panel today will be presenting 4 pillars for keeping the peace in the age of unacceptable use. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. We'd love to hear from you today. If you have any questions during the presentation, type them into the question box in your control panel. Only our presenters will see the questions submitted, and we'll have time at the end to address each of these questions by email following the presentation. Also near the end of the program, you'll see a badge on your screen, and you can download your continuing education certificates at that time. Now let's get started. We're really excited to bring you this presentation today. Angela and I had been talking about many of the issues that we're going to present to you today for some time before actually formulating this presentation. And the issues we discussed, as many of you have probably seen in the media over the last year, is the number of events that have occurred both inside offices and outside offices where people are generally acting with some level of bad behavior or doing something that gets them really put into a spotlight that can be negative for that individual or negative for the company. And the more we started talking about these topics, the more we realized there was probably an incredible need for HR professionals to really understand what's the impact of an event like this and how can an event like this be managed effectively and maybe in some cases prevented. These events that we'll call canceling or whatever name you want to call these events, they're risky, and they're risky for businesses. And the cancel culture can create legal issues with inside a business. And what we've seen and what we found in our practices is there tends to be an increase in hostile work environment claims around political issues related to conflict that is surrounded by political issues. There can be discrimination claims, whistleblowing allegations, wrongful termination, union protection at the federal level, employment practices, liability insurance claims, social media backlash, unauthorized disclosure, shareholder derivative claims. There's a list of things that could be impacted as a result of one of these events occurring, and we felt like it was important to put this information together to help educate you on how to manage some of these risks. So when we talk about the cancel culture, there's surprisingly some very interesting information about how people feel about what the effects of cancel culture are. 34% think that it's good for society, that companies, individuals begin to recognize behavior that's not favorable or that should be changed in some way. And 30% believe it's effective, but it's overused, and that too many companies and individuals are being canceled. And 20% think it's bad for society and that individuals can't do or say anything. So again, you see, at least divided into thirds, this can really create, potential division within an office or within a company. But there are also some statistics that show Americans are likely to cancel a company if it doesn't say or do something when they're addressing issues of racial justice, women's rights, COVID-19 protections, immigration, climate change, LGBTQ, religion, and politics. And cancel culture can have the effect either in a positive way or a negative way for enforcing some change. And the reality is it's something that employers need to take notice of, HR professionals need to take notice of, and something that's likely here to stay for some period of time. So pillar 1, we're going to talk about early identification of potential conflicts. And really the takeaway for pillar 1 is how do we begin to mitigate, how do we begin to identify and mitigate these potential conflicts before they come into place.
And so with this idea, we have a little quote here, the early bird prevents the tweet. And that's really what we want HR professionals to focus on and take away from this presentation, ways that you can prevent and mitigate allowing cancel culture to negatively affect your workplace. And so 2 best ideas for allowing cancel culture not to negatively affect your workplace are to establish a structure for what issues are escalated and to whom, and to alert management right away when there's a potential conflict, even before it becomes a real issue. And secondly, routinely train and educate all of your workforce about the applicable regulations, laws, and guidance, including when they're revised. Because as the new administration takes over and at state levels and local levels, there are often revised guidelines that businesses and HR professionals need to be aware of. And on some of those topics, what exactly is a subject that could be potentially canceled. We just have a word graphic here to show some of the major topics over the last year that everyone is familiar with. And a lot of these things are only going to increase as more people and employees continue to return to the workforce. In person, that is. And so finally, we really want to focus on establishing policies and practices that the HR professional can teach to the business as a whole, so that it's not just the job of one person or one department, but that everyone is aware of looking out for these issues and how to identify employee speech, actions, and how exactly you should discipline them. What is the process for an internal investigation? What has to happen when there's hiring processes? You don't want to accidentally not hire someone for the wrong reasons. And so we'll get into all of this throughout this presentation.
So just to give you an idea of kind of the framework that we're talking about, big picture, the title, woke millennials and boring boomers, we have to recognize that at some level there's already this existing conflict in the workplace generationally with two very different approaches to just about all sort of manners of things in the way that people tend to work and want to work and how they communicate. And so being able to manage that conflict inside and outside the workplace is really the objective. So we've tried to identify here 5 different buckets, if you will, on what is the conflict and how do these groups tend to interrelate to each other. So we think, starting on the left, it's the conflict between employees and employer. What are the expectations of the employees of the employer? What does the employer demand of the employees? Then it's employers and society. How is the employer presenting itself to the larger audience and to its consumers and to the society as a whole? What do they stand for? How do they organize themselves in terms of presenting themselves in public? And then the company leaders in society. How are those company leaders viewed? How are their actions and statements viewed? The employees in society, and then finally the employees and employees. So this is the framework that we're going to continue to talk about through the course of the presentation and trying to identify where these conflicts might exist. So conflicts between fellow employees. There are plenty of things in the workplace that can oftentimes extend beyond sort of the day-to-day business world. And there's plenty of interaction, socialization in an office, and just during the course of the everyday work environment. So free expression, demands, and complaints, how are those managed? Counseling coworkers for outside activity of the workplace. For example, there's social media use. How do you begin to deal with things that may occur outside of the company but ultimately find themselves being reflected in the office or behaviors in the office? So some examples are sportswear that could be deemed offensive. Political signage at work. And it's interesting that not everything is a hostile work environment. And this is a case, Lear versus Nike. In this case, a white female employee who was very vocal in her support of President Trump was called a racist by a temporary employee who at a later point she ate lunch with and claimed to have learned from. And this female employee complained to Nike also about some of the coworkers' rap music that she claimed was offensive to her because it contained curse words. And ultimately her claim for a hostile work environment failed in that case. So not everything is necessarily because someone finds it offensive or because maybe it's not how they view the world politically can be categorized as a hostile work environment. So a unique development in that case. So also we have to talk about the conflict between employees and the employers. And this is a very interesting case about Coinbase and how they chose to deal with some of the conflict that was arising in their business and in the course of their business. And the way that they chose to deal with it was, I think, unique and very interesting, and I would certainly say more in line with kind of what we see occurring these days. So Basecamp announced a ban on societal and political discussions on the company's internet account. And Coinbase also announced a similar ban on internal discussion of politics. But they ended up getting some pushback, some major pushback as a result of putting those policies in place. And what the main complaint was is that the employees felt like they weren't able to separate themselves from their individual political views and their broader views on societal issues. They saw that there was an overlap between having their views being reflected in the employer's views. And when the employers made a determination that there wasn't going to be any permissible discussion or identification at all of those issues, they really faced a lot of pushback from the employees, so much so that they issued in a follow-up response explaining that it had offered an exit package to any employee who couldn't be on board with its ban. And as a result, 5% or 60 employees decided that they could no longer stay at the company and elected to take the package.
So continuing off of the two areas of conflict that David just presented, the third area is the conflict between employees and society. And this one can be kind of tricky because a lot of employees don't necessarily want their employer to regulate and control their life outside of the walls of their business and where they work. But in this situation, which was highly publicized, I've coined it Cancel Park at Central Park in New York during the pandemic. It's a very highly publicized scenario where a white woman who was walking her dog not on a leash in a leash-required area of Central Park called the police on an African-American bird watcher who asked her to leash her dog. And as a result of that is really what we're focused on, not necessarily her actions, but he did record her actions, and the video was posted by his sister to Twitter, where it was viewed for over 30 million times within the first few weeks of it being posted. But the really important part for our presentation here is that within 24 hours, that woman had given up her dog and resigned it to the shelter. She had publicly apologized, and she had been fired publicly by her job as the head of an insurance portfolio management at Franklin Templeton. And it wasn't just a firing over her actions outside, but as you can see through this tweet here, they released a statement about how she did not align with the goals of the company. And so this is something that is really important for businesses to keep in mind, and we'll talk about a little bit later on. How exactly do you manage releasing a statement about an employee while protecting their rights, but also respecting and protecting your own brand and image when an employee who you want to be a former employee has done something publicly notorious, essentially?
One of the things that's unique about this case is that it was viewed on Twitter 30 million times. And a lot of what as we were thinking about these topics, one of the things that you have to recognize is that the amount of anger in a situation like this is really quite substantial. And what we have to be concerned about on the employment side is having that rage redirected at the brand and at the company, and early identification of what can we do early on, either to address the anger that's being felt here and to avoid having ourselves become the focus of that anger as these events unfold.
Yeah, and exactly like David just mentioned, that is our next scenario, is where the company is the direct target of society's rage. And sometimes it can be a good thing, because if a company can change something about its identity or its branding or marketing and increase its value for its shareholders and for its public perception, that's generally considered a positive thing. So we have a few examples here where they were brand changes that were met with some public outrage, but overall the statistics show that people in society thought it was time for a change for some of these brands, like the Aunt Jemima brand, the Uncle Ben brand, the Miss Chiquita logo. And so things like this are only going to decrease the value if the company is only receiving negative attention and negative mentions related to something that it could change, that could then increase its value. And so we have a few other examples of companies that have been canceled by society for different things, whether it's a brand or something that they have said or done. And so some of these things are positive changes, like we've said, that have been forced by social media. But the really important takeaway here is that social media's role continues to grow in the cancel culture movement. And we have a few case law examples of actual recent cases that support that argument as well.
The other point that I think comes out of that slide is a lot of what we're talking about too is, the ability of an executive or a decision-making authority to address these issues in a non-emotional, thoughtful, non-political way that preserves the revenue of the company and the brand, and the recognition that these issues are out there in the marketplace, and they have tremendous emotional attachment and tremendous emotional, like we were talking about earlier, rage, associated with them, depending on what the issue is. So it's that recognition that we're really focusing on, and how to manage that.
Right. I think anytime that there's change, especially with a company or a brand that people are familiar with, there's going to be automatic backlash because people don't always like change.
Right.
But sometimes, like we said, if it's a change that is going to remove the negative surrounding a brand, it can be for the positive.
So this is an example, a hypo that we wanted to go through of an actual case. This is Guilar versus Roland Corporation US, and this was in June of 2001. Lewis had worked for Roland for 11 years until he was fired, and he alleged that he was constantly bullied and harassed because of his race. He was called Mexican, gardener, terrorist, and other racial stereotypes. And in 2011, a coworker created a video that depicted him as a Hispanic migrant worker flying on a plane from Cuba to New York to work as a gardener. The video was still circulating in 2017. In the last 4 years of his employment, the executives, including its CEO and the VP of sales, routinely sent pictures of Donald Trump with phrases such as "build the wall" to him in group messages using company phones. After Trump became president, clients started texting him similar messages regarding the border wall and insinuating his Hispanic heritage. Furthermore, Lewis alleged that not only did his employer not give him the support as others, non-Hispanic sales managers, but the supervisor heavily interfered with his work, including ordering him to use deceptive sales tactics. So as a result of the stress, he began taking antidepressants in 2017 to manage anxiety, and in 2018 he started documenting his complaints with human resources. Thereafter, he alleged he was harassed more frequently with greater coordination. So Lewis alleged that alleging racial discrimination and retaliation in violation of Section 1981 and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Although noting that intentional infliction of emotional distress claims rarely proceeded in the employment context, it's actionable when the employer clearly abuses power it holds over the employee in a way far more severe than typical disagreements or stresses caused by the average job environment. Here, Luis alleged that his supervisor, the CEO, and the VP of sales all engaged in systematic harassment that went beyond the typical types of disagreements because they had power over him. So Lewis not only alleged that he was subject to derogatory comments and slurs, but also that his supervisors forced him to engage in deceptive sales practices to the detriment of his own sales and his commissions. He also alleged that his supervisor heavily interfered with his work. And although minimal, the facts he set out were sufficient to allege the employer's actions amounted to extreme and outrageous conduct, overcoming the employer's motion for summary judgment, even if Luis might not have ultimately established the element.
And so we just want to continue on with some of the answers to that hypo. Luis not only alleged that based on the background of Luis's case and where he actually was able to meet the factors of very strict elements and tests to establish his claim, what exactly can a business learn from this very present scenario in this very present case? So we have a few takeaways here, and the first one is that everyone within the organization must be trained on company policies. This is especially so because in that example from 2021, his supervisor, the CEO, and the VP of sales all were part of the harassment and discrimination against him, and as well as the Human Resources Department, because after he complained to HR, his harassment continued to grow. So that's a knowing retaliation against an employee, which is something that an HR employer should know that they shouldn't allow, let alone be part of perpetuating. And so secondly, company phones were used for harassment, violating company resource policies. And this is a huge problem because this automatically increases the liability of the company because the company allowed its resources to be used for the objectionable actions. And so we've included some draft language here that could be used so that it would limit the company's liability in the event that employees or even management misuse the company's documentation or the company's resources. And so we have the use of company resources, including but not limited to IT, internet, company-issued phones or computers, to violate any company policies, including but not limited to harassment, discrimination, or retaliation, is a violation of company policies subject to discipline, up to and including termination.
You know, and to this example, I mean, it's unfortunate, but it seems like what we were dealing with in this case too is also, you know, a culture that tolerated, you know, the abuse of an employee as far back as 2017. And HR professionals have to be aware and have to be mindful. If you have a culture where it's okay to harass someone or tease someone and everybody thinks, oh, you know, we're just having fun, understand, you know, that there are feelings involved and people may not think it's funny, and especially if it's in these areas that are sensitive or could be sensitive. So understanding what the culture is in your company, and if you have a culture like that where it's being encouraged at the CEO level, it's something to take very seriously and you know, try and address before, you know, these claims arise, or before you no longer have any workers because they don't want to be there.
Exactly. I mean, David just hit it on the head right there. Essentially, the primary problem is that it seems like it's an organization-wide problem with the way that it's managed. If HR, the CEO, vice presidents are all part of the objectionable actions. So if it's a publicly held company, the stock is going to drop every time there's one of these lawsuits. But even if it's not, he won an intentional infliction of emotional distress tort. So an intentional tort against individuals, those individuals can be directly liable for their actions. And so finally, that leads into our third takeaway from this, that HR must take affirmative action to protect complaining employees from retaliation and promptly investigate those complaints. So in this actual case, harassment increased after speaking with HR. So the exact opposite of what should happen. And the video circulated for more than 6 years at the company where he worked. So obviously there was time throughout there for someone to do something about it and stop it. And finally, the employee worked for years under these conditions, which automatically increases the amount of damages that he would be awarded because he suffered for so long under intolerable conditions. And so this really is a really strong case to keep in mind as we proceed through the rest of the presentation and address a lot of the other practical tips for HR and businesses to keep in mind. But next we're going to go on to another hypo of a real case with similarly shocking facts and outcome. In this one, Lisa Ellis was an at-will employee and vice president with BNY Mellon's Pittsburgh office, and she sued her employer for reverse race discrimination after being fired over her social media post. The post at issue was posted using her personal but public Facebook account and commenting on a local news story. The news story was about a councilman who had been arrested for driving a car through a crowd of demonstrators protesting the police shooting death of an African-American male in the East Pittsburgh area. And she commented on a news story about that event, "Total BS, he should have taken a bus to plow through." Because it was a public Facebook account, it was very quickly found out what job she had and where she worked, and immediately the Bank of New York Mellon received numerous calls, emails, messages, tags on Facebook, emails, everything directly to the CEO and the CHRO as well. Most of the messages contained similar language asking, does BNY Mellon allow their employees to promote attempted vehicular homicide? Does this represent your core values? What is your policy on social media that represents your company? Is this how you allow your employees to act and represent your community? So these questions are really real questions that no business and no HR professional wants to be asked about their employee or be confronted with in the heat of a moment after an employee has done something. So thankfully for BNY Mellon, they already had a proactive approach in place to be able to handle this type of event. All employees were expected to comply with the code of conduct and social media policies as a condition of their employment. And following all of the backlash from the community, a unanimous decision was made that the only thing that they could do was to terminate Ellis, effective immediately. There was nothing short of that that would be suitable for her actions. And although she was a good employee who had had no previous problems, no one felt that anything short of termination would be justified.
one other thing that I think we have to mention as part of this discussion is that the stress of the pandemic, isolation,
Absolutely.
the political divisiveness has created an environment for people where they suspend judgment, they say things online emotionally, and not to excuse this behavior, it's disgusting. But why would a VP at a major bank do something like that? And I think as HR professionals, we have to recognize that people may be under tremendous stress. They may be doing things that would be completely out of character. And it's another point to consider, as you're training, as you're talking to supervisors, that they should be aware that people may be engaging or maybe under a serious amount of stress, and try and work that into a training program or a mental health program if it becomes something that's clearly obvious within the business.
Absolutely. And I think that those are some really great proactive approaches that businesses can take. And I think that it's unfortunate because if something proactive had taken place here, perhaps it would have changed the outcome for her and she would not have made such a post and been terminated because of it.
Yeah.
However, the Bank of New York Mellon did have a really strong code of conduct in place that the court continually cited directly in its opinion, saying that they were not going to grant the employee's claim of wrongful termination because of how strong the language was of the code of conduct. And in the introductory letter, the chief executive officer of the bank wrote a really strong introduction that said that the code itself cannot address every possible situation. When an employee is uncertain whether something is right, the employee must ask, could the action affect the company's reputation? Or would it look bad if reported in the media? And stopping right there, had the employee asked either of those questions before she made the post or reached out to someone about her post before making either of those, she likely would not have been terminated because she would not have made the post. And so as he continues in the code of conduct, if the answer to either of these is yes, the employee must speak with a manager, the compliance and ethics department, legal or human resources, or the ethics office before doing anything. So looking at this introduction to the code of conduct alone, we can already see that the employee violated the code of conduct. She did two things that the answer was yes and did not seek out the opinion of someone at a different position within the bank. So she clearly violated the code of conduct, giving them a right to terminate her. And additionally, the bank had a really strong social media policy as well, which is something that is a little more cutting edge, but I think that David and I would agree is very important in these times, especially because under their social media policy, employees' use of external social media must comply with that code of conduct that we just read. So again, if asking the question, will this look bad on the reputation of the company? If the answer is yes, then you can't make that post on social media, or you can't do that thing and be an employee. And so she directly violated both policies, which is why termination was really the only outcome that could have happened in this case. And again, there's another quote from the social media policy here that just really sums up what the court thought and how important it thought that these policies were.
So what are the takeaways? That a single significant violation of one or more of the employment policies can justify termination in some circumstances. Social media policy draft language: employees are prohibited from engaging in conduct that could harm the reputation of the company in any way. And the code of conduct was very strong here. The company has a reasonable expectation that an employee uses good judgment and respects others. And one post was offensive, demonstrated poor judgment, showed a lack of respect for others, and harmed the company's reputation, and encouraged violent behavior. And this was the first time that Bank of New York and Mellon terminated an employee for violating social media policy. And finally, really, in today's age, it's very difficult to separate yourself from your online identity, which is tied to your employment identity. And so where maybe 5-10 years ago, people generally felt like they could separate these two things, I think the recent cases and the facts are pretty clear that if you say something on social media, even if it's your own channel or whatever medium you're using, you do run the risk of having consequences from your employer. So what are the other additional takeaways? Design policies that provide broad discretion to discipline and specific applicability of acts to policies. Social media policies apply to personal use of social media by employees, contractors, and consultants. Policies that explicitly grant the employer broad discretion can be preferable to those that prescribe standard punishments. With that discretion, the employer has options in how it evaluates the specific conduct, the actor's position, reflection on the company, and discipline. And why is that important? Because the employer really has to have the flexibility to evaluate the facts of what occurred and really make the best choice for the employer that's possible. And the way that that's done is through having that broad discretion.
Yeah, definitely. And just to follow up on that, I think that the idea of that broad discretion allowed the company here to have a unanimous decision on what they thought was the best outcome. So everyone agreed, that termination could be the only option in this scenario based on the broad discretion of the language of their policies. So that's really helpful for a business to keep in mind. And so on to pillar 2, build up and avoid being brought down. This is something that we really want to give some of those more practical strategies for your HR business to be able to convey to the business overall about ways to avoid falling into these conflicts. So part of this is managing a response when one of those conflicts that we just went over happens to your business. During difficult social, political, and international conflicts, what is the best strategy for your business and your HR? You want to focus on the strategy from all of these perspectives of what's best for employees, for customers, whether it's better to have a proactive statement or to have no response in some circumstances. But keeping in mind that having no response to major social, political, and international conflicts can be viewed as having a response on them as well, just remaining silent. And so part of that is that the business has to design their approach, and it's really a good idea to design the approach with all of those different areas in mind that we just covered, because if you don't have an approach, like I just said, you're running the risk of being canceled for not having a statement at the ready about something of major importance. And sometimes, even if you don't want to have a statement, you might need to have a response about not having a statement, which I think David can get into a little bit more when we go into the policies up next.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, it really becomes very relevant to the kind of business that you have and your market and understanding your market and what your consumers' expectations are. Maybe you're an HR professional in a company that doesn't really have anything to do with anything that could even be perceived as political. Your products are industrial, and they're not reaching a mass market that would be influenced one way or the other depending on who you're selling to or what your business looks like. So some of it is really sitting down with the management teams and trying to understand what are our risks and doing that risk assessment. But beyond that too, really focusing on policies that bring together employees, employers, and society. If your consumers feel like that you're handling things appropriately and they can identify with the decisions you make, they'll be happier and more loyal. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done internally to determine really what the risk looks like, what's the risk picture, and how to best to address it.
And just kind of following up on that idea is not only is it based on what the product is or what the service is that the business offers, but also what the employees who work there believe. Because even in the event where you might have a completely apolitical product that doesn't have any effect on what's going on in society, your employees might have very strong feelings about what's going on, and they might be the ones to demand either an internal statement or an external statement on something that's happening. So that's why it's so important to get the voice of every stakeholder in this process to make sure that no one feels left out, because you don't want to isolate different people who work for you just because you haven't taken into consideration their opinions.
That's a very good point. Also, being informed and being respectful, right? Really understanding what are the issues that people are upset about, what are the expectations of the workforce, whether it's generational or any other category of interest that the workforce may have. Most employers likely have employees or clients on all sides of every issue. And that doesn't mean that you can never take a stand or acknowledge who you may, but you have to acknowledge who you might alienate by taking a stand, and you have to be prepared to answer for one side or the other, depending on what may happen. So it's important to really think through, these issues beforehand, and also, to be focused on bringing the workforce together on things that unite the workforce around the business and the success of the business, and doing as much as may be possible to remove some of these, external influences that could cause people to become divided. So that takes us to pillar 3. So in this section, we're really going to talk about how do you manage the crisis? How do you plan for the problems? What are you supposed to do when the mob comes to your door and you're under pressure to respond, and how prepared are you to do that? So really the goal is to avoid becoming the employer that's under fire. And we think there are 3 main components to that. The first is to train, and then enforce those policies equally. If there isn't a level of expectation set in terms of what the response should be, or what we're going to do if these scenarios happen, then you're really going to have a problem when this occurs, because no one will know how to appropriately manage it or react. The second one is communicate regularly with employees about the policies and any changes that might be occurring in light of remote work. And the third is to develop and implement a crisis management plan. Very important that you have a plan in place to address some of these issues as they occur. And so what does that plan look like? What are some of the elements of that plan? The first element of the plan is that you want to be able to determine whether or not this is an issue that we want to weigh into. That's a very important thing. Sort of walking through and understand, is it better for us to stay silent? Is it better for us to take a position? And if we take a position, what are we going to say? And then determining what are the stakeholders likely to decide regarding this position, and then to deliver a statement, and then prepare for the response. And this is a process that can work both internally or externally. But obviously that first step is determining whether or not this is something that we want to weigh into, and whether or not this is something that is really going to affect us or impact our business. So the crisis management plan. It's very important that internal and external responses are prepared in advance if possible. And companies may go through and identify, as part of a risk assessment, what are the issues that they're most likely to face, and begin to think about, okay, if this scenario happened, what would our internal response be? What would our external response be? And kind of go through those scenarios to make sure that they're on the shelf and ready to be deployed in the event of a crisis. And also to think through, if the employees or stakeholders disagree with a position, the company may have good reasons for taking a stand or taking a position, but how do they deal with any criticism that may come from the employees? Media and news backlash. One of the most important things as part of your crisis management plan is to have a communications plan, and to maybe have an external resource that specializes in crisis communication to be able to manage, monitor, and account for all of the information that may be in the news. To draft all statements with decorum. What do we mean by that? To really take the emotion and the vitriol out of these scenarios, and really to try to communicate facts that are not communicated in a way to further inflame. The other interesting thing that we've seen companies begin to do is they provide a forum for employees to respond or to give feedback about a position the company's taken or a particular policy of the company. And that can be very effective at giving employees an outlet to share views and to allow management to respond to those views and to create a dialogue and to handle conflict or address sensitive, difficult, or controversial issues within the workplace. The benefit of that is knowing and being able to sort of understand real time the temperature of the employees and the company, and to be able to account for how to manage or deal with that.
Absolutely, and I think that keeping in mind the crisis management plan throughout the day-to-day acts of an HR manager and through all of the stakeholders who are part of it is something that's really important, because you never know when it's going to need to be put into action. So the plan really has to be routinely updated and something that is talked about and known or else it's not going to be effective when it is needed. And so talking about when it needs to be effective, we're addressing here taking decisive action based on those established legally sound policies, including part of the crisis management plan that we just discussed. And so every state except for Montana is an at-will state. And most of those states have exceptions, but Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Nebraska, Maine, New York, and Rhode Island have no exceptions to the at-will employment doctrine. So essentially what that means is that employees and employers can leave their positions, or the employers can let go their employees at any time for any legal reason. And so under this idea, unless there's an employment agreement in place between the employer and the employee, they're allowed to leave for whatever reason they want. So you might end up having a lot of employee turnover if you're consistently ignoring their views and perspectives on things of change and on releasing statements on important issues, or if you're designing your policies too broadly so that they don't have a voice and they can be penalized or even terminated for actions that most everyone within the company would take. And so it's really important, especially with the rise of additional union activity, collective bargaining agreements. The distinction between independent contractor agreements is also a hot issue right now. So all of these things together can be something that when an employer is ready to fire someone because they're making too much noise about their political views or their ideologies, they really have to stop and think for a second whether there's something that could be affecting whether that's the right course of action to take. And the next part is really part of what a lot of employees would raise if they think that they are wrongly terminated. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act really has to be kept in mind. Applicants, employees, and former employees are protected from employment discrimination and retaliation based on the listed protected characteristics. So that means that while you're allowed to fire an employee for any reason under the at-will employment doctrine if they don't have an employment agreement in place, you're not allowed to fire them based on one of these protected characteristics. And so where there's some overlap between their ideology and their protected characteristic, it can become an actionable issue or something that can actually be raised at trial or in litigation. So it's something that really needs to be kept in mind. And moving on from that point, that's really why it's so important that HR professionals and those charged with making those enforcement decisions about termination and other actions create their policies and procedures in a way that can be fairly applied. So you don't want to allow for any ambiguity on whether someone has been let go because of a protected characteristic. You want it to be clear based on the policies and procedures in place why they've been let go. And this should really apply regardless of title, rank, or position, and regardless of what the issue is, because again, all of this is not specific to one political ideology or one ideology in particular. It's really focused on a broad spectrum because you don't want to target someone for any ideology. And so secondly, it's really important to clearly and regularly train employees on those procedures and enforce them consistently as well. So no one should be exempt from these trainings. And I think that with a lot of remote work, a lot of training has somewhat got pushed to the side, or it's not necessarily regulated to make sure that it's not just playing in the background while someone's washing their dishes instead. So we want to make sure that these are actually enforced and that it's something that all of the employees are aware of, regardless of their position as well. And finally, our third step is to regularly review and revise those plans when they're outdated or incomplete. And this is just so important because there's constant revisions at the federal, state, and local level to all sorts of employment-related agreements. And there's often updated case law that should be significant as well, including the two cases that we presented earlier on. Those are really recent decisions that are really important for HR professionals to be aware of.
One other subcategory that's not the main focus of the presentation, but we wanted to raise is the privacy implications of communications that are made on social media. And crisis management requires rapid response, which may in some cases require access to an individual's account, whether voluntarily or through the assistance of the court. And employees may contest the right of an employer to review their social media. And how does the employer safeguard private employee data that it gains through social media? So all of these are issues that it makes sense to sort of think about and address beforehand for when these questions arise. There's some clear policies in place, or someone has done that work and can provide an answer on what should happen next in these situations. So the final pillar that we're going to be talking about is pillar 4, maintaining objectivity and respect in the workplace. So how do you withstand the war within? Design internal policies to require respect from all sides and to treat all sides fairly. So really understanding what it is that brings everyone together. How can individuals be listening to each other in a way that doesn't cause tension and conflict within the workplace? To realign outside issues and focus on employees or leadership within the orientation on the company goals and concerns. Focus on what the company does. At the end of the day, everybody's activity at work is going to be to the benefit of the business and to earn profits and to serve the shareholders. And maintaining that focus more on what unites employees and the success of the business and the common success, rather than on what divides them or outside external issues. And again, as we mentioned before, a public forum or a town hall that's an outlet for employees to discuss matters of importance, and is also an opportunity for the business to be able to identify what are the issues that may be on the horizon, what are people thinking, what are they concerned about, how are they affected by current events, and what do they expect from management in some of these situations. So it's a really important way to get some advanced communication on some of these issues and things that could later become crises.
Yeah, and so that I think is a great lead into a little discussion on code of conduct and acceptable use and social media policies. So as we saw in the Bank of New York Mellon case, the employee definitely lost her case because she violated both policies, because her violation of the social media policy was also a violation of the code of conduct. She posted something on social media that violated the code of conduct for the business. So by designing those policies to go hand in hand, that's really a best practice that you can take away because it's really stronger for the company when they're facing liability. So these policies should be designed to understand when the employee directly or negatively addresses the employer, what kind of social media policy is in effect then. And when an employee's actions or words do not implicate the employer, but just by nature of being an employee with the business suffers poor branding and image from that employee's totally unrelated actions. What happens at that point? And finally, the code of conduct should also reflect the company's and community's values and require employees to adhere as a condition of employment, because that really gives those employers that out. And so we have a few examples here of ways to revise your social media policy and code of conduct in a positive and flattering light. So these are some examples, these big, bulky definitions here that the court basically said in that same case are not as strong because you're not going to be able to keep employees if you have super harsh terms of conditions to work there. If any time someone uses their personal social media on computer premises or on the company premises at all, even using their personal devices, not connected to the network or anything, but they're sitting at their desk, they can be fired for that action. It's basically like policing the employees to a step that most employees are not going to be willing to tolerate. And that really goes into the second point here as well, that anything that's posted on social media, no matter where it's posted, no matter what it's about, no matter even if you do link to your employer or not, but if someone just happens to know where you work, even though you don't link to your employer, that can somehow get back to the employer. It reaches a level that a lot of employees and businesses, frankly, are not comfortable getting into that deep of monitoring of all their employees' actions. And so we have these positive ways of revising your social media and code of conduct policies instead, which have actually been upheld by courts in different cases that we've read. So by allowing broader terms, like we see here, we authorize occasional employee use of social media so long as it does not involve intimidation, harassment, threats. So really allow employees to do something that you know there's really no way to stop is oftentimes a better approach. And then add that limiting language, saying that you're allowed to do it until it crosses over to this point. And then at that point, the employer has to get involved and has a right to get involved. And then again, the second point about the social media, it really puts the burden on the employee with this type of language, allowing them to think about what they're posting and revealing to them that if you choose to post this, you know that something might come back on you. It might affect your employment. And so it really allows discretion for the employer and also puts the responsibility on the employee in these circumstances.
So how do you begin to manage some of these risks and bring peace through order and options? So you can offer employees some options for healthy, controlled outlets, but create a policy to delineate the borders. And so here we've given some examples of some of the things that may be controlled outlets, and some ways to sort of channel the energies that are associated with some things that may be controversial or not controversial, political, and to sort of get them in a place where they can be managed. So this next slide is really talking about employment practice liability insurance, and how important that can be in this environment to have that insurance in place. The carriers are reporting an uptick in discrimination and harassment claims upon return to work, and it's increased partly because of vaccination status and the controversy around vaccination or non-vaccination. But the key is that it really should be reviewed. You should take a look at your employment practice liability insurance and determine whether it needs to be updated or revised in light of these new risks.
Absolutely. So we just want to wrap up here by showing our 4 pillars again, just to really cement in how important it is to keep each of these 4 things in mind, to have a strong foundation for a healthy business. So first, it's really important to have that early identification of potential conflicts. So we spent a lot of time there outlining the different types of conflicts, because without being aware of where those conflicts can come from, you can get blindsided, and being blindsided is going to result in an increased liability and risk. And build up to avoid being brought down. So really take care of your employees and also your customer base and listen to them. Just understand what their positions are. Even if you don't agree, people often just want to feel like they have a voice and that they're listened to. And so if it's not really part of what your business is and you don't think that you have a role to play in the broader conversation, sometimes having that conversation can actually change your perception of what employees and other people think of your role. And so we went into depth on the crisis management and how to plan for problems so that you're not, again, attacked by those, but that you can have a proactive response in the event of any conflict. And finally, understanding that any policies need to be designed to obtain objectivity and respect from all sides and on all issues. It's really an essential part. So I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to participate in our seminar today. And we hope that you have some valuable takeaways for your organization. And we hope you'll join us for our remaining programming this week. Thank you and have a great afternoon. And let me see if we have time for a few questions, David, do you think?
Yeah, I think we may have some time.
Okay.
Let me just see.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of questions that have come in, so we'll just kind of touch base on a few of those now. So this one says, how should you handle the conflict between employees when it occurs outside of the workplace, where they're fighting on social media, but then it comes into the workplace? What is the role of the employer in that scenario?
Yeah, no, I think, just more generally, I mean, these are really unprecedented times, and no one in history, as far as I can tell, has had to deal with these issues in the workplace. And I think it's part of an initial conversation with employees to really have them understand what the expectation is of their own behavior, of the way we communicate with each other, of how we use judgment, of how we treat each other respectfully. And I think that if you see these kind of problems evolving, you really have to nip them in the bud and bring the individuals in either separately or together and begin to counsel them on what the expectation is for behavior in the office and behavior to each other, and what's tolerable and what's not tolerable, and to have that kind of thought through long before these issues arise, like we've been discussing. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think that that's a really great approach, because oftentimes people just want to, if they speak in person about something that has been going on online, it's going to be a completely different conversation, So if employee A and employee B are fighting from their home computers, and then they have to talk to each other and their boss about the issue,
right? Sometimes
it can immediately resolve that problem just by forcing that conversation in person.
Yeah. More than, I think, politics or whatever the issue is, people care about being able to continue to earn a living in their livelihood.
Absolutely.
And that puts things into perspective when you're sitting in front of your boss if you've had a fight with your coworker. So,
yeah, definitely. So I think another question that we have here that's important is, how exactly can human resources professionals talk about these issues with really busy management level employees and executives at their companies?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think that is the key to being successful here. You have to have that buy-in from the management team, and we saw in the case involving Lewis that management was an active participant in that. Right. So evaluating your company's culture, making sure that everybody's attending these types of trainings, and that nobody's sort of excusing themselves because they're too busy. It really has to be kind of a united effort around addressing these issues and managing these risks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because sometimes if you let those highest level employees get out of the hook of these training things, they can be the employees who can actually affect the company because they're heads of the company. Yeah. So their direct actions can result in liability for the company beyond their own personal liability as well. Yeah,
and people are going to take their direction from the leadership and the management teams. They're going to replicate that behavior if it's poor, and if it's positive, replicate that behavior. The tone is set at the top. So here's another question. Angela, why shouldn't a business just make the strictest policy possible to limit its liability?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it's the natural approach. Okay, you want to make sure that you don't have any liability, so draft your policies in a way that says, everything's on the employee, disclaim all liability. But as we saw, that's just not practical, because you can't disclaim all of the actions of your employees based on legal theories. I mean, the employer is responsible in large part for what their employees do. And so it's generally better, the case law shows it, that when there's discretion allowed for the employer, that ends up having the least amount of liability for the employer by making the language a little bit broader with more discretion, rather than as strict and difficult as possible, because otherwise you're just not going to retain high quality talent pool if it's really difficult to work there.
Yeah, very great points.
All right, well, thank you everyone for your time and attention, and please enjoy the rest of the presentations this week.